Chesed. I do not understand what I do, but for what I want I do, Chesed. For things to differ, they must differ either by being or by non-being. Chesed. Simeon, son of Shelumiel. But since being is that which makes them identical, they cannot differ by being. And if I do what I do not want to... Jeez, is the whole thing like this? Ahiez or... Pedazur. That really means something, doesn't it? Hello, my name is Peter Franson from ChristianGeekCentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Right now you're watching me play one of my favorite old school video games. You might be thinking, geez, this guy kind of sucks at video games. You might also be thinking, man, that video quality looks terrible. Why doesn't he just play this on an emulator? He could get such a better sound and video experience that way. Which brings me to the question on my mind right now. Should Christians use emulators or abandonware? Now, by emulators, I mean software made unofficially by one or more people to allow users to play console video games on their PC. And by abandonware, I mean software that is no longer being supported by its owner that can be found for free download online by unofficial third parties. Now, right up front, I'll let you guys know that I have used unofficial emulators and ROMs are digital copies of console games. But I've used unofficial emulators and ROMs many times and played some abandonware games too. I played the original Japanese Final Fantasy III from beginning to end, and that's the Japanese one, not the one that came out in the US, which is actually Final Fantasy VI, but the one that you really couldn't get. Except at the time that I was playing it on an emulator, you could get it, the completely redone version for like the Game Boy Advance or DS, I can't remember. But I didn't want to buy a DS, and I also was kind of curious about the playing the original NES experience, just translated to English. So I emulated that, as well as much of Dragon Quest VI and some of Final Fantasy V. All those I played on emulators. On top of that, I've dabbled in numerous other games through emulation that have been too many for me to keep track of, so I am no stranger to unofficial game emulation and abandonware. When emulation first came on the scene a number of years ago, the legalities involved were pretty murky and gray, and even in recent years, the legal aspects of emulation trigger a multitude of responses when the topic comes up. On the forums of video game site giantbomb.com, the question was asked, is emulation illegal or not? Well, here's a sample of some replies from that thread at giantbomb.com. Technically, yes, but at this point, no one gives a crap. Do you know anyone who has been arrested for video game emulation? Well, if you've owned the cartridge before, no, it's not, but if you haven't, nobody really cares at this point. Not like you're going to get caught, so it doesn't matter. Sorry, but it doesn't. I've done it in the past to revisit some of the older games on SNES that I don't have but have rented long ago and wanted to play some GBA games. You're technically not stealing it as long as you don't keep it, right? Right. Oh, whatever. Ha ha. Another response, no one really cares. Actual emulation is legal. There's nothing wrong with one machine emulating another machine. It's just when you start stealing software or disregarding licensing agreements, things start to get a little dicey. I've never heard anyone get in trouble for it. I'm going to call it de facto legal if nobody bothers to enforce the law. My policy is no one will know if I don't tell them. Smiley face. Well, not really. They can find my IP, but whatevs. Emulators aren't strictly illegal, and neither are copied games. It's the distribution of copied games outside of personal use that is illegal. Think of it like ripped DVDs. While DVD rippers aren't strictly illegal, the distribution of ripped DVDs are. As far as games and systems that are out of circulation go, they still, again, I'm still reading quotes of different thoughts and responses to this question, is emulation illegal or not? As far as games and systems that are out of circulation go, they still belong to their respective publishers. It's always a possibility that they might re-release them. It's very rare for games to go truly free even after going out of print for a long time. And one more response was, It's not illegal to run emulator software, nor is it illegal to make your own ROMs as long as you have the original. Everyone has the right to create backups of their own bought goods for private purposes. It's when you download a ROM you don't own that it becomes illegal, even if the emulator itself is completely legal. For clarification, it's also illegal to download a ROM of a game you already own, since the seeder is not allowed to distribute software that is not theirs. Any emulator plus homemade ROMs of self-bought goods for strictly private use is legal. Okay, so that's just a sampling. I'm sure you've heard stuff like that. Maybe you subscribe to one of those responses and would claim that response as your own as well. I've been hearing mixed and contradicting responses to this question for years, and most responses seem to be based on second, third, or eighth-hand information. Not very satisfying to me. Until a few months ago, I hadn't really made an effort to look into the issue myself, in part because law can be very complex and technical, and I wasn't sure I was equipped to find the answers. I'm not that smart. Nor was I sure that the answers could even be found through the means at my disposal. The internet's great, but can we really find all the law and all that kind of stuff online and get access to it? Is it even possible? But if I'm honest, a significant reason I hadn't pursued more understanding of this issue in the past is because I was afraid I might not like what I discovered. This is not a quest I think that any Christian is likely to undertake when they are in the middle of playing an unofficially emulated game or piece of abandonware that they really enjoy. But as I have found myself for a while now without any games I'm interested in playing through unofficial emulation or abandonware, I've concluded this is probably the best time to hunt down answers that I can consider objectively. Now, to be clear, I'm looking for an answer to a very specific question, and that is, should Christians use emulators or abandonware? So I'm not just asking if the practice is legal. I think that's part of the question, but I'm not just asking if the practice is legal, and I'm not expecting my findings to be applied to non-Christians. I'm not going to because we're going to look at the Bible, and I'm not going to hold non-believers accountable to obeying the Bible. So this is a question specifically for Christians. Should Christians use emulators or abandonware? I'm specifically asking, maybe I should say even more specifically, whether or not a Bible-believing Christian, a person who believes that the Bible is the authoritative word of God. Did I say that? The authoritative word? Yeah, okay. I thought maybe I said a nonsense word there, but I think authoritative is a real word. Anyway, so yeah, what does the Bible essentially have to say about these issues? Well, to answer this question, I think there are 4 key elements to consider. Number 1 is console game emulation and the use of abandonware legal. Number 2, what does the Bible say about our obligation to obey man-made laws? Number 3, to what standard are we held accountable in our obedience to man-made laws and or the Bible? And number 4, what are the consequences for Christians who disobey man-made laws or commands of Scripture? The first element is going to take much longer than the others to examine, I think, so we're just going to focus on the legal aspects of this issue this time and try to address the other aspects next time in part 2. So, for now, emulation and U.S./international law. Tracking down actual legal information on this topic has been very difficult for me, and some might argue that what I found is inconclusive. I'll let you judge when I'm all done sharing here. I'm no lawyer, so naturally I'm not presenting legal advice here, but the information I found in my search was close enough to reading the actual law in black and white, which I was able to do in some cases, to bring me to a conclusion on the issue. In 2013, a lawyer at the Metro UK Entertainment website offered his thoughts on the issue of emulation. Now, I should add that this lawyer stated clearly that he is not a case lawyer in the realm of copyright law, nor should his thoughts be taken as legal advice, and certainly not mine either. Even so, regarding game console emulators, he said, quote, "They are perfectly legal. There has been case law to this effect in both the UK and the USA. The caveat here is that in coding the software, you cannot use the same lines of code as used in the original code. The problem is when the emulator is used in conjunction with a ROM image, either of a game or of the BIOS file, BIOS file, that may be needed to complete the emulation. The BIOS file is essentially a copy of the original code used to boot the console." Unquote. And you can look in the notes for a link to that full article. I'll be sure to give you that. And while we're gaining some international perspective on this issue, there's an important factor worth noting. Because of the, I want to say Berne or Berne Convention, B-E-R-N-E Convention, countries are required to respect the copyright laws of other countries. And I'll include a link to some info on that as well. So, for example, if you live in Russia and want to download material that has a US or Japan copyright without permission of the copyright holder, you are still violating the laws of Russia. If the emulator you are using uses the BIOS of the original console it is emulating, your emulator is illegal. Now back to the topic of BIOS files, how can you know what BIOS your emulator is using? That's hard to say. Many emulators for older cartridge-based consoles do not require the installation of the original BIOS file. However, this does not mean that the original BIOS is not already a part of the emulator software. I'm a bit ignorant when it comes to that. However, if an emulator ever requires you to download the original BIOS of the console being emulated from a separate location, whoa, that's a big red flag, and likely an indication that that the people hosting the emulator are aware that hosting a copy of the required BIOS themselves would be illegal. If you download the original BIOS of a console on a site not belonging to the copyright holder of that BIOS, you are violating copyright law. I know a while back when I was looking into emulators for the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, the only ones I ran into specifically said that I was going to have to download the BIOS from another site. And I ended up not going through with that because that was the first time I looked into this whole issue of BIOS, and I was like, wow, okay, well, I definitely want to draw a line there. So I've not emulated a PlayStation or PlayStation 2. As I said, I don't know the status of the original BIOS file with emulators for like the Nintendo and Super Nintendo. So is it illegal to use a game console emulator? Yes, if it unofficially makes use of the BIOS from the original console. Otherwise, no, it's not illegal. And, I'm saying officially and unofficially because, obviously if Sony decides to put an emulator on the PS4 for PS1 and PS2 games, which, come on, Sony, do it! Obviously, that's going to be legal. And the emulator that's on your Wii or your Wii U to play the older games that they make available on their eShop, obviously, those are official, those are legal. So that's the only distinction I'm making there is unofficially is stuff that basically is not being given to you by the copyright owners. It's emulator is illegal if it unofficially makes use of the BIOS from the original console. Otherwise, no, it is not illegal. Good advice, I think, would be to stay sharp and be as informed as you can be about the nature of any emulator you use. All that said, not many people use console emulators without playing games or ROMs. Is it legal to use unofficial ROMs? Well, some of the best info, I think, on this issue can be found on Nintendo's own website. Now, yes, I can already hear you saying, well, of course Nintendo's going to say it's illegal to play unofficial ROMs. How can you trust the information on their site? Well, I would respond by saying that if Nintendo were to publicly misrepresent copyright law on their official website, they would be in a huge amount of trouble and would have been pounced on quickly for it. But the first time I looked at the legal portion of their website was around a year ago, and shenanigans have not been called on them yet. Yes, you'll sense their one-sided bias in what they write. They certainly don't try to enable the discovery of any loopholes in the law on behalf of emulation gamers. But I'm convinced that they do not state anything that is false regarding copyright law on their site. And so their legal page serves as a useful resource as we look into the issue of game emulation, especially since most game emulation is for that of Nintendo consoles and games. Again, check the notes for a link to the entire legal page at Nintendo. With just a little bit of research, wherever you go online, you'll easily discover that by default it is illegal to use downloaded copies of ROMs. It's very common for gamers to assume that if you own or have previously owned the game you are using a downloaded ROM to emulate, you are protected by your right to have a backup copy of software that you purchased. It's even more widely assumed that if you delete the ROM within 24 hours of downloading it, you are not violating the law, which I've always thought was interesting. I've gone back and forth between believing whether that's legit or not. Well, to this, Nintendo responds, the backup/archival copy exception is a very narrow limitation relating to a copy being made by the rightful owner of an authentic game to ensure he or she has one in the event of damage or destruction of the authentic. Therefore, whether you have an authentic game or not, or whether you have possession of a Nintendo ROM for a limited amount of time, i.e. 24 hours, it is illegal to download and play a Nintendo ROM from the internet. Pretty clear cut. However, note the exception that even Nintendo acknowledges. If the copy is made by the actual rightful owner in order to retain a copy in the event of the original's damage or destruction, it would appear the ROM can be considered legitimate, at least in the UK. And I'll provide a link in the notes again for the direct link to that legislation in the UK. I have not been able to locate proof of such a law's existence anywhere else. I know some people are under the impression that that kind of law exists in the US. If you can send me a link to the actual law document online, then I would love to get that. Please let me know if you find, documentation of a parallel law in the US. However, notice that even if you own the original game, your copy of the game must be made by you in order for it to be legal, even under the archival provisions. Now, one device suited to this purpose is the Retrode, which creates digital ROMs using original SNES cartridges, and I'll try to provide a link to that as well. But once again, this may only be legal for UK gamers, and as a reminder, I'm no lawyer, okay? So tread carefully here, guys. Now, what about the fact that many games being emulated are no longer available for purchase? Have their copyrights expired? Have they become abandonware? Well, regarding game copyrights, Nintendo states, U.S. copyright laws state that copyrights owned by corporations are valid for 75 years from the date of first publication. Okay, games were born in, home console games certainly were born in late 70s? So just do the math on that. We have not hit even close to 75 years yet. They go on to say the copyrights of games are valid even if the games are not found on store shelves, and using, copying, and or distributing those games is a copyright infringement. Now, abandonware, that's not a legal concept. That's kind of a web word, I think. As Wikipedia states, although such software is usually still under copyright, the owner may not be tracking or enforcing copyright violations. So the abandon part of the term abandonware refers to the direct involvement of the copyright owner in enforcing the copyright or in supporting the product. It does not refer to a lapse in copyright for the product. In a nutshell, whether the copyright owner of a game is doing anything with the game or not, they still own the copyright, and the law is still being broken when a person downloads their games for free without their express permission. This applies to both ROMs and old PC quote-unquote abandonware games. To sum up the legal portion of this issue of emulation gaming and abandonware gaming, playing unofficially emulated or abandonware games is illegal in almost every case. The best scenario I can come up with for being able to play such games legally is if you personally own the game and you personally created the backup copy and you live in a country where that's legal. And, again, you created the backup copy, not downloaded it from online, and you are playing it on an emulator that does not use any code from the BIOS of the original console. That's the best case scenario where I think you're probably good if all of those things line up. But I can't even confirm that this scenario is 100% legal. So even in this best case scenario, proceed with caution. And in all other cases, I hate to say it, we're violating the law if we play emulated or abandonware games. Now, I know for me that's a tough pill to swallow, but maybe it shouldn't be, how important is it really for us as Christians to obey the laws of corrupt, man-made government, especially laws like this that may seem extremely stupid and pointless at times? What does the Bible have to say about Christians and their relationship to man-made laws and governments? Well, stay tuned. We're going to look at that next time in part 2.
For thine is the Christian, and the geek, and the central.com. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated.